Welcome and thank you for coming to Family Research Council and joining us for this noontime lecture event. Here today we're going to be hearing from Dr. David Curry, the President and CEO of Open Doors USA. Open Doors does great work on behalf of the persecuted church and Christians worldwide who are facing hostility and persecution for their faith. Today, Dr. Curry is going to be highlighting the recent World Watch List, which discusses and focuses on locations where Christians are especially persecuted throughout the world. You know, one of the great things about hearing this area, though it can be depressing and distressing at times, this material is often not reported in the larger news media. It's often not heard about unless you seek out the information. We appreciate Open Doors for highlighting these problems and persecution of Christians, and it's especially important to focus on presentations and resources like this and what Open Doors provides to know accurately what's going on worldwide and how Christians are being treated in many places. In addition to the government persecution that we often think about, we think about religious liberty, religious freedom issues, we think about the government persecuting people and imposing laws that restrict their religious practice. In many places, there is social hostility and hostility from a population and cultural disapproval towards religious practice. In some respects, we see this here at home. In many respects, to a larger degree, we see this worldwide. And this is something else that Open Doors also focuses on, and we're glad that they track and highlight. I'm going to let Dr. Curry get into more of the details regarding this report and some of the more specific instances of Christian persecution. I will say that I was at the event at the National Press Club where Open Doors released this report and discussed it, and it was particularly helpful to hear the story of a Nigerian woman and her own account of how she's been persecuted in her country. Yet, in spite of the attention to the facts on the ground and the persecution, you could see her trust in the Lord and walk with God that really strengthened her and lifted her up. And that was something that as we deal with this material, it was important to be reminded of the hope that you saw in that woman's story. And I think Dr. Curry is going to talk a little bit more about that. So without further ado, I will let Dr. Curry come and take the stage here.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and I so appreciate the Family Research Council and the work that they do on so many important subjects that really helps draw attention to the values and the issues that are concerning to people of faith in this country. So grateful to be here. Grateful also for their concern about persecuted believers. Tony Perkins and this entire team is just so great about raising this issue and drawing attention to it on a nightly basis on their programs, in forums like this, and in the national media. So I do greatly thank you. For those of you who are watching online, we welcome you. It's cold here in Washington, D.C. today. I am from California now, originally from Tacoma, Washington, so I'm used to the wet, but maybe not the cold so much. But it's good to be here in a warm environment with friends. So thank you so much. What I'm going to share today is a difficult subject, let's be honest. I think one of the challenges that Christians have when they start to look at persecution that is happening around the world is this unbelievable and very strong urge to look away because the stories are intense and the violence is so gruesome. This week we saw a tragic incident of a Jordanian fighter pilot who was burned alive, and the world is shocked at it. But unfortunately, I have to tell you that sort of brutality has been happening to Christians for some time now at the hands of ISIS and other terrorist groups and other forces. So it is a very difficult subject. And I want to qualify what I'm about to say, although we back it up with data and all these sorts of things, by letting you know that I'm very hopeful about as a person of faith, about what God is doing around the world. And even in the midst of very difficult circumstances, and really this strong urge is just a human being to want to, because of the compassion of our hearts, look away when we see this kind of tragedy. We have to focus on what is actually happening, what our role might be in bringing about solutions, and drawing attention to this difficult subject. And I think it's very important. Let me give you a little bit of a history on Open Doors if you did not know about this organization. We're not a new organization. We've been around for 60 years. Many people first came to know about Open Doors through our founder and his life story. Brother Andrew was a nickname, a covert name that a Dutchman took upon himself when 60 years ago he began to smuggle Bibles into the Soviet Union. He was one individual who felt called and motivated to try to make sure, not to proselytize the world, but to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to read the words of Jesus and to know who he was and what he said. And so he simply began to share Bibles behind the Iron Curtain at great personal danger to himself, and then one more, and then another, and before long he had a team, and that was the beginning of Open Doors 60 years ago. We're celebrating our anniversary this year. Brother Andrew is still alive, is still taking on dangerous missions even at 86 years of age, and he's a great inspiration to all of us. And therein really is the beginning of our values and what we're about, in that we are really not, beyond the advocacy and the things we're going to talk about today. We're really just about trying to introduce people to who Jesus was, what he said, and give people an opportunity to read the Bible, to know for themselves what he said, and to decide for themselves, have the freedom to decide if they believe. So today, Open Doors is still the largest covert ministry in the world, and when you see the countries on the World Watch List, you will know from the description of these countries that they are dangerous places to work. And so we want to be careful about what we do. But in the process of sharing Bibles throughout the world and the words of Jesus throughout the world, we discovered the need for important data and research to back up our conclusions. For many years, Open Doors worked within the Soviet Union, as I said, exclusively. And then as things began to change in the 90s and the Soviet Union disintegrated and the wall came down, we looked farther into other countries, and in years previous to that, in fact, to countries like China, which was facing great persecution of Christians, and there was great oppositions to people having Bibles and to meeting together in churches. And so we expanded into China based on both an impulse and an understanding of what's happening in the world, but also this data, these numbers, the sense of what was happening on a large scale, the persecution of Christians. And then, of course, some years ago, into the Middle East and these regions. And what developed from just a simple need to know what was happening around the world to Christians has really become the centerpiece of much of what we do to educate the American Western Christian on what's happening in Christian persecution. And that would be the publishing of what we call the World Watch List, which is the 50 countries, the top 50 countries around the world, which, based on independently verified data, are the lead persecutors of Christians. And so this World Watch List that we released just a couple weeks ago here in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club is the most trusted source on persecution in the world today. And what it says is troubling. With the release of this new watch list, we are essentially documenting the fact that in the last 12-month reporting period, we have seen the greatest persecution of Christians in the modern era, both in violence, in extreme pressure, in alienation within their cultures. Christians are being persecuted like never before. In some countries, like Nigeria, which is ranking high on the list, you have almost 2,200 people who have been executed for their faith. In other countries like Syria and Iraq, the numbers are equally as staggering, and the brutality is hard to comprehend. But the World Watch List is, as I said, trusted around the world because of the data that it presents and the restrained way in which we present the data. We are only giving you the stories and the numbers which we can verify. We know for a fact that there are many people beyond the numbers that we are reporting that are persecuted, that are executed for their faith. But there are many countries in which we have a hard time documenting those things. People who have been in prison for so long that their families have lost track of them. We don't know what happened to them. Countries which have such secrecy and governmental control that it is impossible to verify the deaths. And so what you see presented here is a low estimation of what has happened around the world. So the data is important. But most important is the effect that it has on people. When you talk about Nigeria, number 10 on the World Watch List, you're talking about people like Damaris Atson, who was with us, as was mentioned just a couple weeks ago. Her husband, a lay pastor in Nigeria, was called at work. A friend said, "There's trouble in the city. There's trouble in town." And they knew what that meant. What that meant was that Boko Haram was looking for and attacking areas where they believed Christians were working, were at churches. And so they had set up an informal network of notification. And when they heard that, they said, all right, let's be careful on the way home. Damaris's husband was on his way home from work and decided that he was going to take a taxi. But as he walked out of his workplace, he saw a man, a blind man, who himself was a Christian, who did not have the money or the resources to take a taxi. And he feared for the life of this blind man and decided that he would walk him home. And so he sent his other friend on his way in a taxi, and he took the time to try to help this blind man navigate home in the midst of these Boko Haram attacks. Unfortunately, he did not make it. Boko Haram and their terrorists, Islamic extremist terrorists, attacked him, stabbed him to death. And Damaris was here telling us her story as a widow of how she rebuilt her life and how God was present with her in the midst of that tragedy. You see, that's one of the stories that is highlighted here, and that is in these numbers, and that is that these are real people who have husbands and wives, who have children, who have jobs, that are part of the fabric of their society, and yet they're being attacked and killed for their faith, for nothing more than their faith. And there's repercussions for it. So it's about people. But I'm going to walk through the data just a little bit today. I'd highlight a few countries, just a few trends, and then I would like to take questions on any country that's on the list, on trends that you may notice. We'll take as many as we possibly can, and it's always more fun and interesting if you want to be interactive. Number 1 on the World Watch List this year for the 13th year in a row is North Korea. North Korea is the most restrictive country in the world to be a Christian. Since the mid-1940s and the conclusion of the war and the bifurcation of the Korean Peninsula, Christians have been a target. They have been called enemy number 1 by the government. The government is a communistic, totalitarian state that seeks to input upon their people a sense of hero worship of their leaders, not just Kim Jong-un, the current leader, but his father and grandfather before him. And Christians, having a worship of Jesus and an understanding of him as their Savior, run theologically and in every other way in opposition to that. And for so many years that there has been such intense persecution that if you go on the websites of the State Department and the CIA, they will try to validate for you the fact that Christianity is no longer really a force within North Korea. But I'm here to tell you, based upon our research and our understanding of what's happening within the country, that there are many, many Christians still within North Korea, and that the Christian faith is flourishing even under intense persecution. What is it like to be a Christian in North Korea? Well, it's very, very dangerous and very, very difficult. There aren't any home churches or cell churches as you would know them. A Christian fellowship experience might be something like you meeting a friend to sit on a park bench. That you would know, hopefully, that they would not report you to the secret police or to your neighbors who are being paid to report on who's a Christian and who has the Bible and who's talking about Jesus. I remember the story that I heard this last spring when I was handed a paper notifying me of the death of Esther. Esther is a name that we've given this North Korean woman. She was a person of faith who came to know Jesus while she was in a safe house trying to escape into China. Esther, when she came to personal faith in Jesus, her life was so transformed that she knew that she wanted to go back into North Korea and share her faith with her family. As she went back and started to share her faith, the most prized possession to her was her Bible, that she kept hidden very carefully. Unfortunately, as the story goes, the secret police came to her house. It was reported that Esther had a Bible, and they began to torture her and beat her to try to get her to report, "Where is your Bible? Where is your Bible? We want your Bible." Then under pressure, they paid off or pressured her grandchild to report her for extra food and to really disclose where her Bible was. They found it. They took her to prison, and she, as I was notified this past spring, died in prison for the crime of owning a Bible. That's what it's like to be a Christian in North Korea. There are, by our estimates, about 400,000 Christians in North Korea, and they are often subject to persecution by imprisonment, by torture, and all manner of pressure within the society. We believe that there's almost 70,000 Christians in labor camps. Now, if you're familiar with some of the stories of what a labor camp is like within North Korea, they have 3-generation camps because they so desperately want to push out and eliminate Christian persecution. They will not only arrest you, but your children and your children's children in many cases. So North Korea remains number 1 on the list. Also on the list, as you'll see, is Syria and Iraq, which are number 3 and 4 this year. Iraq and Syria are both experiencing pressure at the hands of ISIS, the Islamic State, as it's come to be known. And this is not a new development. Open Doors began reporting some years ago on the developments in the northern part of Iraq with extremist Islamic forces that were trying to put pressure on Christians, that were bombing churches, that were attacking churches. And with all of the other geopolitical things going on and really, I think, a blindness to the persecution of Christians that still, I think, exists in large part today in the major media, nobody was concerned about what was happening to Christians in northern Iraq. And now, of course, this summer, nearly 8 months ago, ISIS became a major force and conquered an entire region, not just of Iraq, but also of Syria, and has redrawn the map, which you'll see here in just a few moments. But again, it's not just about the map, it's about real people. This is Raja, whose life was deeply affected. She was one of those people just a couple of years ago who was living in Mosul, who was attacked by ISIS. It was not then known publicly as ISIS, but attacked, driven out of her home. And now, as you'll see there, she's wearing a shirt that has a very important symbol. Many people will know it, some people may not. That is a symbol of the letter N, Nasrani, which was the symbol that is reminiscent to me and maybe several of you of World War II, when the Germans would mark the Jews with a special mark to identify this is a Jew and we don't like them. Well, that's exactly what ISIS was doing there by marking every home and every business that was owned by a Christian with the Nasrani sign, saying these are followers of the Nazarene, essentially, followers of Jesus. And so what was tragic in Raja's life is now something that's really a point of pride for her. She's wearing this shirt, and she's working in a camp in Kurdistan, trying to help the tens of thousands of Christian refugees who have come to this area. So she's an amazing story of hope. Even though her life has been greatly upset, she's still a young woman. She's now serving others. And so it's affecting real people in Iraq and Syria. You'll see a little bit of a map here of how the country is divided between Sunni Kurds and Sunni Arab and Sunni Kurds. And each region is different in its dynamic. And in the north, you see where there's a large swath now of Syria and Iraq that is dominated by the Islamic State. So Syria and Iraq number 3, Syria number 4 are part of this World Watch List. What is Open Doors doing within the region? Open Doors is a part of the efforts to help Christians to stay within the country if they would so like, 10 years ago, there were over 1 million Christians in Iraq. Now there are much less than that, maybe less than 100,000 by some estimates. But we are helping to support with other partners, feeding, housing. There's a big winterization issues going on now. This is a man named Father Daniel who runs one of the important camps there in the north of Iraq, helping to serve people, and that we were a part of encouraging and educating in how to work with persecuted believers, trauma counseling, and so forth. Here are some more beautiful faces of Iraqi children. I think it's important that in the midst of the data that we don't get separated from the fact that there are people whose lives have been greatly affected by these tragedies, by the persecution of Christians, and that they have children, and these beautiful kids are Christian children of Christian believers who've been forced into Kurdistan, who've lost all their toys. Many families were pushed out of their homes with just 24 or 48 hours notice. They had to leave behind their toys. And so we're helping these kids to go through trauma counseling to regain some childhood. So as you can see, it's also affecting Syria. And it's now creeping over into some of these other areas as well. It threatens Turkey. It threatens Lebanon. It's obviously threatened Jordan, as we're finding out this week. Okay? Some more beautiful faces. I want to make sure we spend some time on some of these other countries, particularly Nigeria, which is at number 10, which, as I said, had almost 2,200 people who were affected by persecution this year. Nigeria is a unique case. It is a very similar in some respects, in my opinion, to how ISIS has developed within Iraq. What you see in our data this year is that you have, I think, a strong case that shows that the persecution of Christians is a lead indicator, is a bellwether of where a city, a country, a region is going to tip into chaos. You saw it in Iraq, where 10 years there was persecution, there was bombings, there was pressures, there was executions, and then 8 months ago, all of a sudden it tips into chaos, and people are surprised. They need not be surprised. If you're watching the World Watch List, you will see the areas which will either, in the short period of time or within a couple of years, be the issues that are on the front page of the paper. And Nigeria is yet another great example. There are others that I'll highlight as well. But Nigeria has been experiencing attacks much like the Iraqis were facing just a few years ago. You have Boko Haram, which has a very similar Al-Qaeda, Islamic State ideology. They have been making attacks, bombings, like you've seen in churches and so forth. And now all of a sudden, they're beginning to take territory. There's a common pattern here. First individual attacks, then bombings, then the conquering of territory and the attacking of civilian sites like army bases and these kinds of things. That has developed within Iraq just in the last month, where they're starting to take over territory, where they're, as you can see from the map here, spreading over into Cameroon, into Chad. Just a couple weeks ago, in response to, as the media has said, in response to the Charlie Hebdo We Are Charlie protest in Europe, all of a sudden there's a great outpouring of violence and protest in the streets of Niger, which is just to the north, or Niger, as some people would say, of Nigeria. No one even was talking about or knew the presence of these extremist movements within Niger just 2 weeks ago, because they're not paying attention to the World Watch List and what's happening there, which we've been highlighting as a country to watch, because there will be an attempt, certainly, at a regional caliphate in the northern part of Nigeria, which has a large Christian population to the south, but has the strong extremist presence within the north, into Niger, over into Cameroon and Chad. So you're going to see some major developments in this area as time goes on, I believe. A few other things that I think it's important to highlight would be the trends throughout, not just Nigeria and Niger and so forth, but in other parts of Africa. The attacks in Kenya, you have attacks in Central African Republic, which is often wrongly reported as Christian on Muslim violence, and that there's some sort of comparison between what's going on there. That's not the case based on our research and our teams on the ground. What you see within the Central African Republic is extremist groups which have been attacking Christians. The larger society is aware that these extremist groups are supported by people within the community who are letting the attacks happen. And then when the extremists were pushed out, there was a backlash against the people who were complicit with the Islamic extremists. So you don't have Christians attacking Muslims, as has been reported in the New York Times and other areas. What you have is larger population that has understood that there are people who have been supporting these radicals, and when the radicals have lost power, those people have been attacked. It would be somewhat analogous to what happened at the end of World War II, where you had people who, when the Nazis came in, were supporting or supportive of the Nazi movement within these surrounding countries, who may have been German speakers. And then when the Nazis were kicked out or defeated, there was a backlash in some communities against these German supporters. That would be somewhat like what has happened, but it's not the same as saying that Christians are attacking Muslims in the Central African Republic. So these are a few trends that are happening. You see the spread of radicalism into Africa. You're going to see a greater movement in Nigeria and Niger and Cameroon and Chad. You're going to see the continued rise of extreme violence in the Middle East. You have a continual pushing of Christians out of the Middle Eastern region. And then you also have issues within Asia. Countries like Uzbekistan, where just a few weeks ago there are cases like one that I was made aware of 4 families who were reported to the secret police for having Christian materials, CDs, tapes, Bibles, Bible study materials. Their houses were raided. They were arrested. They were charged an incredible amount of fines. And what was their crime? Being in community as Christians. These kinds of things are happening in Asia. We have issues within all sorts of countries. You can see some issues still remaining within China, although they still have greater freedom. China is still on the list at number 29. And so you're going to see these kinds of issues. People are learning from what's happening with the Islamic State, and it is spreading. You'll see some of these within some of the stands, Uzbekistan and others, and within China, within Indonesia. There are still going to be Islamic extremist issues popping up throughout the year. One of the issues that we highlighted in this World Watch List is that you have forces that are driving the doubling of martyrdom of Christians in this past reporting age, and all of those forces are still present and they're still growing. So we expect that the numbers are going to be even more staggering next year. Okay, so those are just a few trends, few highlights of the World Watch List, but I know I promised you that I would take a few questions. Any questions on the watch list, any of the countries that have been mentioned today? Yes, ma'am.
Hold on 1 second to get a mic.
We have a question right up here in the front.
Hi, I'm Penny Starr with CNS News. We reported on your report in January that 9 of the top 10 countries were majority Muslim. But could you comment on, I have 2 quick questions. Can you comment on the countries such as Mexico and Colombia, which seem to not fit that kind of persecution? Can you talk about what the persecution in those countries looks like? And also, does the State Department in any way use your report, or have you had interaction with them on how they rate, countries for religious liberty or persecution of religious minorities? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take your question in reverse order. Yes, the State Department is aware, and we do interact with them and make this material available to them, and try to brief them on our feedback. One of the things that Open Doors is blessed to have is a connection in networks and teams throughout the world, so that we can have firsthand information and stories. And I think that the governments would do well to make use of that information. Your question was about the factors that are driving persecution within Mexico and Colombia, which are both on the list. There are many. Let me back up. I'm going to answer your question directly, but there are different things that we measure when we try to give a number, a ranking to countries and regions on the World Watch List. You would have forces that would be called family persecution in some areas, where you have a difficulty if you're a person of a certain faith and you want to convert to Christianity. You might come under extreme pressure from your family. They might disown you, they might punish you, they might actually even hurt you in some cases or kill you if you convert to Christianity. So there are family issues, there are private issues within the communities that you would be ostracized if you become a Christian. There are sometimes governmental issues in certain regions. Certainly you have countries like Eritrea, which has taken a very extreme ideology, Islamic extremist ideology, and nationalized it, and is persecuting Christians at a tremendous and very brutal rate. So you have all of these different kinds of factors. There are 5 different ways that we rank them, and all of that data is available to anybody who might like it on our website, opendoorsusa.org. But your question was about Mexico and Colombia. What you have there is a largely Catholic country, but you have drug forces, cartels within the country that attack churches, that attack pastors, priests, in many cases hurting them, pressuring them, executing a handful of them. And so those are the factors that are driving the persecution in Colombia and Mexico. It's the same general issue. It's the drug cartels, which are making life difficult for some believers. But it's not in a cultural persecution in that way. Yes?
Could you comment on countries which have shown considerable improvement over the years in regards to religious persecution?
Yes, thank you for your question. Unfortunately, there is no country on the list which has dropped in its score from the last reporting period. All you see is countries getting worse. So there are countries that have dropped. Morocco dropped in the list, but not as a result of it getting better for Christians, just as a result of it getting worse in other places. So it's getting harder to be at the top, which tells you something. When we highlight North Korea, for example, at number 1, it is number 1 despite the fact that it's hard for us to report and to verify how many people have been executed for their faith. We know what we're told. We know what our team is able to verify. But even despite the fact it's very difficult to get information out of that country, we still can rank it at its highest number. And that would be true in a lot of cases as well. So there is no country where it's gotten better, only that it's gotten worse in other countries. There was one question back here, I think, and then we'll go over here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Anne. I have a question. I'm wondering if you could speak to religious persecution in our country. Just briefly, I believe that it exists, although quite subtly. We don't have people in jail because they own a Bible, but it's been reported that there are parts of the nation that accept Sharia law, and even the beheading in Oklahoma could be considered this type of persecution. So where do you see this country headed?
Where do I see it headed? I don't want to speculate too much on future scenarios, but let me use what we do know is happening and some strategies that we see play out in other countries where you have large Christian majorities, but then you have smaller extremist groups. So you could certainly see attacks like we saw in France. Against the cartoonists and against that media. I think you could certainly see extremists targeting soft targets within the United States, churches. I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility. I mean, you might actually wonder why it hasn't happened yet. But I think a larger issue that you're drawing attention to, and I would be careful not to compare any persecution that's happened here in the United States to this point to anything that might be represented on the World Watch List, because they really are at a totally different scale. But I think Christians in the West need to understand that aggressive secularism is a potential force that will develop using laws, zoning, these kinds of things to make free speech Christian values and speech on the issue of Christian values, illegal on some level, difficult. So I think you could see that and maybe are seeing shades of that, but it's not comparable to what's happening on the World Watch List. But thank you for drawing attention to that. Even more critical is that we begin to try to connect what is happening around the world on a spiritual level. Open Doors is fundamentally about who Jesus was and said who he said he was and who we believe him to be. And I think when you understand on a spiritual level that we are brothers and sisters, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, your brothers and sisters are being killed for the faith. They're being executed for the faith. They're being pressured for their faith, losing their jobs and their homes. And we have a responsibility, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, to support them in prayer, to care for them, as if it were yourself, according to Hebrews 13:3. So even though it's not here, we still need to be thinking about them. Yes, right over here.
A country I do remember seeing on your list in the past that I didn't notice in 2015 was Cuba and also Russia. Is there anything you would say about either of those countries?
Yes. You're right. Both of those countries have been on the list in the past. There are countries that we're continuing to do research on, and I think they're interesting countries. One of the issues that we're probably a little slow to talk about, that it is often a driver of persecution, is interfaith persecution. When you have certain sects persecuting other sects, maybe have some in some areas, the potential for Orthodox faith oppressing evangelical faith expressions and this kind of thing. I think you could certainly see that in Russia. It's something we need to watch, where Christianity is not might morph into something. I'm not saying it's this way now, but could potentially morph into something that is not a spiritual movement, but a nationalistic church that oppresses the expression of any sort of individual faith. I think that is something to watch in China. It's something to watch in Russia, where you try to have the state taking over the functions of the church. That could happen. We are researching and keeping our eyes on Cuba and Russia. Yes, sir.
Ernie Olhoff. Question. In the 1950s, the United States made extensive use of Radio Free Europe to broadcast news to behind the Iron Curtain. Is there an equivalent of that today in the Christian community to try to communicate this information? The problem is you have a myriad of different languages out there that you have to deal with. But with social media now, and computers becoming more available, I know EWTN has a shortwave radio network that it uses, but are there other Christian organizations that are trying to breach that gap, excuse me, to provide information, Christian support to people in these other countries?
It's a great question. Open Doors, as I said, our history really is as Bible smugglers. We started out as God smugglers, and today we still experience and view ourselves in that way. It started with us, with Brother Andrew packing Bibles into a VW Bug. It was, just driving them across the border and praying that the border guards would not observe the Bibles that were packed into this little car. The technologies exist now for Bible smuggling, to use the term, to happen through other means and other methods. I think there are people exploring that. I encourage people to be thinking about how to use apps, how to use any sort of technology to share God's word and who Jesus said he was. When the Bible is present in countries, good things happen. And so I think that would be a wonderful development. I think everybody should be thinking about that. And you don't have to use too much imagination to ask yourself, how would I read the Bible today if it was illegal? Would you need an app that was masked with something else so that people, if they found your phone, they couldn't track you down? How would you share it? I mean, there are so many things. I think we need to be very wise about how we progress in this. I encourage people to explore it who have that sort of background. I, however, can barely turn on my iPad, so that would not be something I would know how to do. Yes? Yeah, there's online radio programs. There's all these kinds of things. Satellite TV. Yeah, a lot of countries would have dishes. In some countries, you don't have technological sophistication, so you have to use other methods. But I think that's important. Let's not forget that. Yes, sir.
You said that last year we saw. You said last year we saw the greatest amount of persecution of Christians that we had ever seen. I was wondering, is that solely because of the rise of ISIS and Boko Haram? And also, is there a way to quantify that claim?
Yes, we can quantify that by the fact that we had 4,344 people who were executed in the last reporting period, and the year previous there was only 2,123. So it's literally a doubling of the number. It's driven by a number of factors. You have Islamic extremism. I'm not saying the Muslim faith as a whole, but we're identifying the actual perpetrators are driving the scores on the World Watch List in 40 of the top 50 countries. So that is a large part of it. You still have some totalitarian governments like North Korea, which are using their governmental control to oppress people. And then you have the cultural aspects within certain countries. India, we see a potential for a great rise in persecution and more incidents in India than the previous reporting period from extremist groups, not Muslim, Hindu. But look, when we need to try to foster a culture as Christians where we're respecting the faith of others and having people have the freedom to decide for themselves what we believe, and we ask for the same in return. And I think that's part of what the data is crying out for is a freedom of expression for Christians around the world. And if you have any questions about the data, we have all of that for you. Yes, sir.
You spoke a little bit earlier about the State Department and interacting with state on some of these topics. How about Capitol Hill? Are there certain members that have been pretty receptive to your statistics, or are there commissions or committees that you have seen that have really stepped forward to be able to team with you well?
Well, Representative Frank Wolf has retired this last year. He's been really at the forefront of drawing this to the attention of Congress. We're hopeful. There's several people on the Hill who are stepping forward and talking about the subject. Here's the challenge. The American Christian public, I guess you'd say, I'm trying to find a way to describe this, is not yet highly motivated on this subject. And in my opinion, politics is always downstream from culture. So when the Christians are seeing this as episodic violence and occasionally getting outraged, it's not yet risen to the right water level, so to speak, to get the widespread attention of the Congress. So that's my way of saying, when we start to care as Christians about what's happening around the world to our brothers and sisters, I think there will be more of an outcry, and then the politicians will start to care at a different level. But as of now, I think there are select members who care about this, but I don't think it's widespread. I think that would be inaccurate.
As a follow-up then, how have you seen that communication best distributed to churches and to individuals to then filter to DC?
Yeah, we have a download available for people of the World Watch List, a prayer for people. I think when every church in America, when small groups are starting to pray through this and highlighting countries on the World Watch List, I think then people will begin to have a broken heart for what's happening there, and it will bubble up. But we're not there yet. Thankfully, groups like the Family Research Council are drawing attention to it. There was a question right here.
Speaking of persecuted Christians, and God sees children as seeds of Elohim, I'm wondering why America isn't identified due to the genocide of 60 million children in this country.
You're talking about the abortion debate? Yeah. I agree. I mean, I think what we're trying to do is identify what's happening to persecuted Christians, but we may not be in disagreement on that. Yes?
I'm Richard Corris. I come from a largely secular environment in Los Angeles.
I live in Orange County, so
yes,
we're not far from each other.
Like the entertainment business in Studio City, which isn't exactly religious. How do you think we can get non-churchgoers or people who are not of faith aware of this and on board with supporting persecuted communities?
It's a great question. I think we need to keep highlighting the stories of the individual people who have been affected by this, like Damaris, whose life was turned upside down, 3 children, her husband's attacked for no reason, brutally killed, like Raja, whose picture we saw today, who's a young lady with so much potential, who's kicked out of her home, loses everything she has. What kind of a youth has she had? Not much. So there's a human impact. I think that's important to drawing attention. I think the other thing is for us to try to explain and really use the data to explain the fact that what's happening to Christians, as I said, is a lead indicator with what will be the issues where the countries that are going to tip into chaos. Where you see Christian persecution, that's where the next hotspot will be, because they're oppressing the freedom of religious expression, and soon they'll just oppress speech altogether. So it will affect the larger public, and it is now. When they were attacking Christians in Iraq and just Christians, nobody was saying anything, and then all of a sudden the country's torn apart, and they're surprised. So that's part of it. Yes, sir.
Your expression of, I guess, trying to get the Christians of this country to recognize the problems around the world is important, and you're talking to a relatively small group of people here who are very concerned about that. But I would offer to you that in our country, it's very difficult to get the Christians motivated to deal with the problems within our own country. The social problems that gentleman raised about abortion. Mm-hmm. Now we have physician-assisted suicide coming. These are incredible problems, and the United States is viewed as the model for a lot of the world, and as abortion spread around the world, so will euthanasia. These are incredible problems, and I think there are many Americans who really recognize that there are problems, but they think somebody else is going to solve the problem and they don't have to get involved. And I would try to hope that someone would try to figure out how to activate the Christian community, both in our country and as a natural outgrowth of that, it will spread to other countries.
Thank you. Yes, I agree.
Time for one more question.
Yes, sir.
My question would just be, how would we be able to get more information? Like, what resources could we go to or subscribe to, email newsletters, or anything that you guys would have to continue to get updates and new information on this?
I did not pay him to ask that question, by the way. Yes, opendoorsusa.org. We have data, stories, videos to help tell the story that you could share with people, prayer lists that you can sign up for to get updates on what's happening, bulletins if some story breaks on this subject. So, yes, opendoorsusa.org. A perfect segue. Thank you, everyone, for having me here.
Thank you all for coming. Dr. Curry may be able to stay around for a minute or two if you have other questions, but just thank you for coming today, and have a good afternoon.